You are listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. This episode is a highlight clip from this week's full episode. To listen in on the complete conversation, see the show notes for the link to the complete show. You can help us out by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate every bit of your support. I'm Morgan McKittrick, your producer, and this is Decidedly.
I asked the question, what does money smell like to you? Sean, how about you? I'm just curious. What does money smell like to you?
That's a really good question. To me, it smells clean, which sounds like, that's probably the opposite of true. But it just does. It smells fresh and clean to me. There's that inky smell, but that's what goes through my head for no logical reason. But
this is maybe the opposite of the way I'm supposed to be answering this question. But one time we were walking through a barn. My grandma and I and my sisters were walking through a barn full of horses, and it smelled like a barn full of horses. Yeah, meaning it smelled like horse manure. And my grandma, she grew up on a farm in East Texas. She goes, "Whoa, smells like money." And that has always stuck with me.
She's not wrong about that.
So that's what I thought of when you asked the question.
Oh, that's funny. Well, another Texas story. I grew up in West Texas, and I used to ask this question to my students at Texas Tech, and I can't tell you how many times I got the answer, cattle and cotton. Why? Because that's what they grew. That is West Texas is ranching, right?
That's what turned into money. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what turned into it. For me, money stinks. I'm just the opposite of you, Sean. It is a dirty, nasty stuff. But I think that became from my very early, working at a bank in my very early on. It just stunk. It was nasty. I remember a woman one time in the middle of a West Texas summer coming in when it was really hot and sweaty and give me enough information. She reached down in the middle of her bra and pulled out a lot of cash and set it on the counter. That had stuck with me. And that was not money I wanted to touch. It stuck pretty bad, right? So I think that those are really interesting questions. This is nothing that you would think, oh, why would you ask that question? But it starts conversations, right? About how you started to formulate that idea. Sean, I really like your discussion about the spouse that grew up with money, and now she needed to be more aware of it, but wasn't. That totally makes sense because there was always more money, it sounds like, where she grew up. There was always a way to get more money. And so changing these mindsets is not a one-time conversation. It's a long-term, it's a slow-moving ship, kind of on the helm of a ship. It moves very slowly by a very small helm. Same thing here is the very small decisions we make can move that trajectory forward. So you asked for some more stories. Another story I have is I remember a client specifically that was in a very difficult situation. There were two government workers with security clearances. They were about to lose their job, and quite honestly, they were heading towards bankruptcy. And I remember talking to them and discussing some of the implications of that. And all of a sudden, it came out as I asked more questions that both sets of parents on both sides had declared bankruptcy multiple times. In fact, one set of parents had declared bankruptcy so many times they had left the country and went to live in a third world country. And that was the moment it hit me. This has become a generational expectation. That's what you do when you get into a hard spot. And that had been passed down for at least 2 generations. And we had quite frank discussion of that's what's going to happen with your children. And that's what they're saying. So yeah, I that sounds super negative and sounds like, oh, we're passing down all these money histories and biases, because we could talk all day about the negative side, but think about all of the small things. I remember a couple who were savers. And the Great Depression, my grandmother grew up in the Great Depression as well. I remember going to her house and she cut off the edges of the moldy cheese and kept eating it, right? Like there are so many stories that come out of that Great Depression of just, you make do with what you've got and you keep on going. And I think those are stories of resilience as well. But taken to extreme on either ends, it's out of balance. And that's what we're trying to do, is bring in the balance of yes, it's great to say it's also okay to spend too. And so having these conversations and understanding why someone may be more of a saver than they need to be and why someone else may be more of a spender than they need to be starts to start the conversation and the discussion around like seeing their own behavior. And that's where behavior change begins, is when that communication starts.
Yeah, I used to think that the behavior would change in someone when I would show them the numbers, okay, you're 65.
You are going to run out of money.
You're fine. You should change your behavior. No, but what I found was that the behaviors as a result of somebody's money story, those decisions they would make as a result of their money story, would get them to a point of arrival where they had enough financial wherewithal to retire. And so their spending had always been well below their means. They had always lived a very modest life. And this story is repeated time and time again. And so what I used to think when I started doing this work is I'll show them the numbers and they will start flying first class. They'll not buy a Chevy, they'll buy a Cadillac. They'll travel, rather than, to the next town over, they'll travel international. They'll do all these things because I've shown them that they have the money. And, you're laughing, Mary. I can see you laughing. Because that is so naive. They weren't going to change. Their money story decisions transfer through their whole life. And they were just going the habits that worked well for them. And they got good results from those decisions. They weren't about to change that decision-making structure or framework just because I showed them a spreadsheet.
Yeah, spreadsheets don't change behavior. Maybe that's the big underline from this. Spreadsheets don't change behavior. I remember being in the bank in Midland, Texas. Midland is it's a boom town. Yeah. So high income,
more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the country.
Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome to Midland, Texas. I worked at a large bank there, and I remember vividly watching people walk in, right? And you would see I don't know what the right terminology is, but the ones who showed their wealth, right? The word and I'm going to put wealth in quotes right here, because those were the ones that also came to my window, was like, gave me their credit card and said, I need another cash advance for the weekend. I mean, they were overspent. There was nothing left in the bank account. The most rich ones, the ones that would floor me when I pull up their bank account, were the old rancher in his overalls driving the beat up pickup truck that he parked around the corner because he didn't want to have to pay for parking and coming in. And he had more money than all the rest of them combined. That was, to me, the moment that I was like, oh, that's what the idea. One of my favorite books of all times is The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas Stanley. And it's fantastic because he talks about it. It's big hat, no cattle. And that's what we knew in Texas. You were a big hat, you were a big show up of that, but had nothing to show for it. And those that had it didn't flaunt it. It was very much close to their best. And
so how do you find that once people have expressed this money story you're talking about, this sort of history, that they're able to most effectively utilize that expressed information, maybe that was buried, but you asked the question, use that information to make better decisions?
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do with clients is walk them through what I call a spending plan project. I do this with both my students, who most are master's degree level, and financial planners themselves. And I literally have them track their spending. So they come up with what they think they're spending at the first of the month on one side. Then for a month, they track it to the penny every week. And at the end of the month, they reconcile that and they see. And the reason that I love that so much is it starts to show you on paper. So Sean, it sounds like you're a numbers guy and like to use numbers. For those that like the numbers, you're able to see not as the planner. It's like putting your numbers in an app. It's just going to spit out information, and information is everywhere, right? But for me, if I start doing that myself and tracking it, I start to see my own behavior changes. And I have done this with hundreds of students, many of who are in the financial profession, and say, this was a life-changing experience for me. Because it's not me writing back and saying, hey, you should not have spent on that Gucci purse, or you should have bought this, or you shoulda, right? It's them seeing it in real life, being able to say, oh, that's what Sean meant when he handed me these numbers and said I'm running out of money. that's what he meant. And this is where that leak is. And they make that determination themselves to make those behavior changes.
And how long do you have people do that for?
The best is 3 months. If you can do it up to 3 months, if I can get someone to do it for 1 month and just get them in the habit, but things come in 3 months is ideal.
So what are they doing? Are they getting to the end of the month and looking backwards? Are they writing everything down for the week? Are they checking it every day? How often are they tracking it?
The way that I like to run it is they start at the beginning of the month and they just write everything down, but they think they're going to spend on this. And it changes month to month. Your December looks different than your July, et cetera. And so they'll write it down at the beginning of the month. And then every week, at least once a week, they're sitting down and putting pen to paper, right? And it could be done in a spreadsheet. It could be done however.
Yeah, at least weekly check-in.
At least.
That makes so much sense.
And then at the end of the month, I actually have them reflect back. So we don't even look at the numbers too much. I mean, the numbers are the numbers. It's their reflection. For my students, I actually have them write a whole paper on this of what surprised you? What didn't surprise you? What did you expect? And where do you think those changes would come from? That, to me, is asking those questions is more important than what's actually on the paper and what those numbers mean, because then that starts to tell you where the client's willing to change the behavior, or the spouse or whatever else. I actually have couples do this. I remember one student came in and said, if you want me to get divorced, you'll have me do this. And I said, I'm not looking for divorce, but I am looking for a conversation. And so it really is painful for some. And it's some of the first times they've ever had a discussion about money with their spouse. It's when they sit down to do a project.
I mean, in my experience, I'm talking with, generally speaking, wealthy clients, and generally speaking, people who care about money. If they're not both of those things, then I usually don't meet them.
Right?
Yeah.
And still, when I ask people how much they're spending, I've never had anyone be right on their first guess. Ever.
No.
I've never said how much you spending, and somebody goes, $23,000 a month. And then we look at it and they're right. Most of the time when I ask, they can't even begin to have an answer. They can't even guess. And I'll say, well, to the nearest 1,000.
You're right.
Maybe to the nearest 5,000. The number's so big that to the nearest 1,000.
Right. Just give me a ballpark number.
And I will push them to basically, oh my gosh, Mary, please just say any number so I can move on. And they won't say a number. Yeah. And they'll start counting in their head. They'll start, well, I'll have to look. And
they start real granular.
Yeah.
And it's been $37 on lunch yesterday.
Yeah, so if I do that 6 times a week, that's going to be, and I tell them, I'm like, look, this means that we need to figure out what the number, right? And I'm not so concerned right now with what the number is. I'm more concerned that you know what the number is. And the same thing's true in business. It's like if I say, what was your revenue last quarter? I don't know. Okay, well, first, before we figure out if it needs to go up, down, or sideways, you got to know what it is.
Yeah.
You need to know what your quarterly priorities are. You need to know what your KPIs are. You need to know the numbers in your business. Well, you need to know the numbers in your family as well. And knowing it's the first step. So I imagine that makes all the sense to me that you're saying by tracking it, a function of tracking it alone is, you see positive benefits. Yeah, for sure. Because doing that is one step to increase their awareness from basically zero to now total and complete awareness.
Thanks for making the great decision to listen in to this week's episode highlight. If you want more of what you just heard, see the show notes for the full episode. As always, for the latest decision-making tips, find us on decidedlypodcast.com or on Instagram @decidedlypodcast. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter from the link in the show notes. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review as well. We read all of your comments, so if you learned some decision-making tips today, let us know. Until next time, this is Decidedly. Insights, advice, and comments provided by Sean Smith, Sanger Smith, and speakers identified as part of the Decidedly podcast should not be considered recommendations. Speakers not identified as members of Decidedly are expressing their opinion, and their statements should not be construed as reflecting the views of the Decidedly team. This podcast is produced solely for informational purposes, not personalized advice.